Hello everyone, welcome to Pushpoint. I am your storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you used this video to fall asleep, so before
that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what
time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax.
Story 1. The Lamp in Room 217. It was a Thursday evening when Edgar Summers checked into the Halberd Inn, a forgotten hotel nestled deep in the Berkshire countryside.
Rain had followed him from the city, a dull, insistent drizzle that coated the car and turned the hills into wood silhouettes.
He hadn't planned to stop, but the exhaustion of driving and the steady fog that blurred the road signs compelled him. He hadn't seen another soul for miles.
When the inn appeared through the trees, glowing faintly like a tooth in a dark mouth, it felt more like fate than coincidence. The lobby was attilated but clean. A brass bell sat unused on the desk. The receptionist appeared soundlessly from a door behind the counter, an elderly woman with grey, unmoving eyes and a voice like paper scraping stone.
She gave him a room key without asking for ID or card. Room 217.
Quiet up there. No neighbours this time of year.
Edgar nodded. He had no luggage, only a laptop bag slung over one shoulder.
Just for the night.
She didn't reply, only turned back toward the back room, muttering something he couldn't quite catch.
It sounded like, if it lets him sleep. The hallway upstairs smelled of lavender and old books.
The carpet was worn thin at the edges, and every fifth light bulb flickered.
Room 217 was near the end.
The key stuck slightly in the lock before turning with a dull click.
Inside, the room was simple bed, dresser, small writing desk, and a tall lamp in the corner. That lamp caught Edgar's attention immediately. It was antique brass, topped with a shade made of dark cloth.
It wasn't turned on, and yet
it almost seemed to glow.
Something about it bothered him.
The fabric bulged slightly near the base, like it was hiding a second inner layer.
He turned on the main light instead and tried to ignore it. That night, the rain intensified, tapping on the windows like long, careful fingers.
Edgar, exhausted, lay on the bed with his laptop open, editing notes for a manuscript. But every so often, he found himself glancing toward the lamp. It hadn't moved,
but each time he looked, he was increasingly certain it had shifted, somehow leaned a little closer, or its shade turned just slightly.
He laughed to himself.
Lack of sleep and too many ghost stories, that's all. But when the lights flickered, briefly dying and coming back, the lamp was on.
He froze.
He hadn't touched it. The bulb inside cast a dim reddish hue. It buzzed faintly, like insects caught behind glass. Edgar stood slowly, walked to it. He reached for the switch, but as his fingers brushed the base, he felt a pulse like a heartbeat beneath the brass. He recoiled.
The light went out. He backed away slowly, not taking his eyes off it.
Then, after a few tense moments, he laughed again, louder this time, to break the silence.
Jesus, get a grip. But sleep would not come easy, not with the lamp. Sometime after Edgar awoke to the sound of whispering, not outside, not from another room, but from within his own.
He sat up, heart racing.
The lamp was on again. This time, its light pulsed like it was breathing.
The whispering grew louder, still unintelligible, but with a rhythm like a chant. Edgar stood, sweating, eyes fixed on the lamp.
Enough, he said aloud, voice cracking. He marched to the corner, seized the lamp, and yanked the cord from the socket. The lamp stayed on.
Then something moved behind the fabric of the shade.
A slight undulation, like a hand brushing from the inside.
A voice not his own spoke directly into his mind. "Thank you for listening," Edgar screamed.
They found him 2 days later, curled in the corner, eyes wide, lips torn open from whispering to himself non-stop. The lamp was missing.
The room was empty except for the indents in the carpet where it had once stood.
Downstairs, the receptionist sighed as the paramedics wheeled him out. Room 217, she muttered, always too curious.
Story 2. The Hollow under Blackwine Farm. When Maggie Coulter inherited her great-uncle's farm, she wasn't surprised to find it decrepit.
She was, however, surprised to find the cellar door nailed shut from the outside.
Blackwine Farm lay in a forgotten stretch of southern Kentucky, surrounded by rolling woods and silence so thick it pressed against her like a second skin.
The house itself was a creaking husk of timber and brick, the land overgrown, the sky always seeming a shade too grey. It was the kind of place that felt ancient even if the record said 1890. She arrived on a wet afternoon.
The rain followed her up the gravel drive in thin streaks, pattering gently on the car roof like fingernails. She hadn't seen another house for miles.
The real estate agent had left the keys in the mailbox, along with a handwritten note. Don't go into the cellar. He didn't like it being disturbed.
No signature.
Inside, the air smelled of mildew, and something else salt, maybe.
The wallpaper peeled like shedding skin.
Every mirror in the house was either cracked or removed. Maggie unpacked slowly, trying to shake the feeling that the house was watching her.
She chalked it up to isolation and the thunder rumbling in her bones. It was 2 nights later, after the storm had passed, that she heard the knocking.
3 slow, deliberate raps from under the floorboards. She froze at the kitchen table, tea halfway to her lips.
Listened.
Silence. Then again. Knock, knock, knock.
Exactly beneath her feet.
Maggie stood, heart in her throat.
She hadn't even explored the full house yet.
With a flashlight and a firm grip on a kitchen knife, she began her search.
She found the cellar door in the pantry, hidden behind stacked crates and old tarps.
It was nailed shut in a crude X, as if to ward something off. The wood around the nails was blackened.
She hesitated.
Then on impulse, pried the nails free with the claw end of a hammer. As the last one came loose, the door exhaled a long, low sigh that raised the hairs on her arms. The smell hit her instantly. Damp stone, something metallic, and an undertone of rot. The steps descended into darkness.
She wasn't sure why she went down. Curiosity, perhaps.
Or the whisper that slid behind her ear. You are already here.
You might as well remember. The cellar was far larger than the footprint of the house.
It stretched into tunnels carved directly into the limestone beneath, rough-hewn and cold.
Her flashlight flickered. Something moved just ahead, too fast to see, too quiet to track. Then she heard the humming.
It was low, tuneless, but deliberate.
Male, maybe. It came from deeper in the hollow. She should have turned back.
Instead, she followed. The tunnel led her to a chamber with a ceiling so high it vanished into shadow. The floor was uneven and littered with mirrors, all shattered fragments arranged in spirals around a stone platform.
Upon it sat a chair, and in the chair, facing away from her, sat a figure.
Still,
unmoving.
She took one step closer, and the humming stopped.
A voice raspy, but not hostile, floated toward her. You don't remember me, do you? Maggie didn't speak.
The figure shifted slightly.
His back hunched, spine too long, limbs too thin. A patch of grey hair clung to the scalp.
You left me here when the fire came.
You went upstairs, and I stayed. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. Something old and broken stirred inside her memories of a screaming night. Smoke. A locked door at the base of the stairs. Her mother yelling to run.
She was only 5, but the cellar was never supposed to exist. I waited for you to come back.
I counted the years.
She backed away slowly, but the ground behind her had shifted. The tunnel was gone. Only black walls remained.
Come sit. Sit with me, Maggie.
The mirrors around her began to hum, each one vibrating faintly, and in their fractured reflections, she didn't see herself. She saw him, the thing in a chair, over and over, younger and older and twisted, staring at her from behind glass, and behind every reflection, something else moved. Dozens of hands pressed against the glass, desperate to come through. Maggie screamed, but the sound died before it left her throat. The walls rippled, the floor cracked, and the light from her flashlight vanished entirely.
When a search party came 3 weeks later, summoned by a worried cousin, Blackvine Farm was empty.
Only the cellar door was different, nailed shut once more, each spike driven deep. One man, a deputy who pried it open, made it halfway down the stairs before coming back up white-faced, silent and shaking. He never spoke again.
Story 3. The Watcher in the Field.
The village of Dunmere had no name on a modern map. Only coordinates on an old surveyor's chart and whispered directions passed between the elderly at church halls.
Even then, most agreed it was best left forgotten.
But Eric didn't believe in superstition.
He was a landscape photographer, a chaser of fog, ruins and stories that could sell in classy black and white.
He came to Darmia on a drizzling October morning, fog clinging low over the fields like a dirty blanket.
The road had long since vanished into rutted gravel, and his phone lost signal an hour before.
But the place was perfect.
Abandoned cottages slouched into the grass, their roofs sagging.
The skeletal remains of a chapel loomed from the hilltop.
And beyond all that, just past a crumbling stone wall, stretched a single field of pale, brittle stalks.
Eric paused, camera raised.
There was something in the field.
At first glance, it looked like a scarecrow tall, narrow, with limbs too long and a head bowed under a white-brimmed hat. But it wasn't tethered, and no frame held it up. The thing just stood there, amid the motionless stalks, silent and solitary.
He zoomed in.
The lens fogged, just for a second. When he wiped it, the figure had moved slightly, still standing, but now facing him.
Eric blinked, then smiled uneasily.
Weird.
He took a photo anyway.
The sun never broke through that day.
The grey deepened. The wind never touched the field.
And the scarecrow, if that's what it was, remained unmoving as he wandered the ruins. But when he reviewed his photos that evening, huddled in the broken cottage he claimed for shelter, something felt wrong. Every photo of the field showed the scarecrow,
but it was never in the same place twice.
In one, it stood at the far end, head cocked. In another, it stood closer, just behind a stone outcrop. In the final photo, the one he didn't remember taking, it was just outside the cottage window.
His breath forked the glass.
He turned slowly.
There was nothing there.
But outside, the stalks rustled, though there was no breeze. Something moved at the edge of sight, tall, thin, deliberate. Eric closed the shutter, lit a candle, and told himself it was just the wind.
That night, the knocking began.
First on the window,
then the door.
Always in threes. Knock, knock, knock. He tried to shout. No sound came. He looked through the peephole. The figure stood just beyond the porch, staring at the door, hat low over its face. Too tall, arms too long. The candle flickered violently, casting shadows that refused to stay still.
Then came the voice, barely audible, like someone speaking through soil.
You saw me. Eric stumbled back. The door creaked not from hinges, but from pressure, as though something leaned heavily against it. He grabbed his camera instinctively, like it could protect him.
He clicked the shutter blindly.
Flash. For a second, the whole room lit up white. The figure was inside, standing behind him. The next morning, the villagers, what few remained, found the cottage empty. Eric's gear lay scattered, his camera still warm. They didn't touch it. They never touched anything left behind in Darmia.
But some nights, when the fog rolls low and the stalks whisper, travellers swear they see a tall figure in the field.
Not standing, not watching, but slowly, carefully, taking photographs. Story 4.
The toll house burned. It was nearly dusk when Ruth Travers arrived in Granley Hollow, a forgotten hamlet deep in the moors, a place that hadn't seen new faces since the war. She wasn't there by accident. Her grandmother had been born there, long before the family moved south, and Ruth, a historical novelist in need of inspiration, had taken the old letters and vague stories as a sign.
The village consisted of little more than 9 crumbling cottages, and a single inn, the toll house sitting at a crooked bend in the hill road. It was built of ancient stone, roof sloped like a spine, its windows narrow and dark. Atop it stood a bell tower, no larger than a cupboard, with a rusted iron bell that looked as though it hadn't rung in a century. Inside, the air was dry and heavy. The innkeeper, a silent man in a wool sweater and distant eyes, offered no greeting, just handed her a brass room key attached to a warped wooden tag. Ring 3. You'll hear the bell tonight, he said, voice as thin as paper. Don't answer. Ruth blinked. I am sorry, but the man had already turned and disappeared into the back.
Her room was small but comfortable, the windows warped by age and streaked with rain.
From them, she could just see the silhouette of the bell tower through the gathering mist. She set her notebook on the writing desk and unpacked.
That night, the village was silent.
No engines, no radios, no passing footsteps, only the slow, eternal groan of the wind curling around the inn's beams. And then, just past 2 o'clock a.m., the bell rang. It wasn't loud,
It didn't clang like a church bell.
It was soft, almost careful ting, ting.
Ting as though it was being rung by something unsure of its strength.
The sound drifted down through the walls, into her chest.
Ruth sat upright in bed.
A memory surfaced. Her grandmother, once muttering half-drunk stories at a family gathering. If the bell calls you, don't let it see you listen. It's always looking.
Outside, footsteps scraped the cobblestones, slow dragging, coming closer.
3 knocks sounded on her door. She didn't breathe. The footsteps paused. The handle twitched.
May I come in?
The voice was strange, measured,
almost kind. I heard you arrive.
I think you belong to me. Ruth backed away, heart pounding. She grabbed the desk chair, wedged it under the door. Another knock, more insistent.
The bell rang again, louder this time, echoing inside her skull.
Open the door. She didn't.
Eventually, the bell fell silent.
The voice receded. The footsteps dragged back into the fog.
At dawn, Ruth went downstairs.
The innkeeper stood by the hearth, unspeaking.
She confronted him.
What the hell was that last night?
He only looked at her, eyes rimmed red.
You stayed in room 3, he whispered. That's the room it always calls to. What is it?
He turned slowly toward the fire. It comes when the moor forgets your name.
That bell. It tolls for the ones who were erased.
Ruth didn't understand. She left that morning, drove away without stopping. But as she turned onto the main road, something strange happened. Her phone rebooted itself.
Her GPS cleared all saved destinations. She couldn't remember her grandmother's full name.
Then her reflection in the mirror flickered.
She returned to the city, tried to resume life, but things
slipped.
Friends didn't return her messages.
Her editor swore they hadn't spoken in years.
When she visited the archives, the birth records she had once found were now missing, as though her family had never lived in Granny Hollow.
Then one night, in her apartment, the faint sound of a bell reached her through the open window. Distant, but getting closer.
You heard me once, a voice whispered in the dark. That makes you mine. They found her apartment abandoned.
Her clothes were there.
Laptop open, teacup still warm. But of Ruth Travers, there was no sign.
And in a village no longer listed on any map, the toll house bell rang once more. Story 5. The Quiet Room at SD. Elora's.
The SD,
Elora Institute for Mental Restoration, was a place forgotten by time, an old sanitarium buried in the foggy hills north of Whitestone.
Though most of its sprawling wings had long since been abandoned, one section remained open as a private rehabilitation centre. It was there that Dr. Simon Harlan took a temporary post, intrigued by the quiet mystery of the place and enticed by the generous salary.
It wasn't until his 3rd day that someone mentioned room B113.
Oh, that?
The head nurse said with a tight smile.
We call it the quiet room. Never used, really?
Patients don't like it.
Simon frowned.
Why is it still furnished then? She hesitated. Because every few months,
someone ends up in there.
It was an odd answer,
but not enough to concern him at first.
The room in question was in the old West Wing, a dim hallway where the lights flickered inconsistently and the walls seemed to lean inward.
The door to B113 was like any other, whitewashed, scarfed, with a viewing slot sealed shut.
When Simon first peered inside, the room was empty. A narrow bed, a dresser, a heavy back chair in the corner.
But as he stood there, a pressure seemed to build in his ears, like he'd descended underwater. The longer he lingered, the louder it got, a dull, humming silence that pressed into the skull.
He turned away quickly and didn't return for several days. Then one night, a patient screamed.
It was Mr. Ellery, a former conductor plagued by auditory hallucinations. Simon found him clawing at the hallway walls, eyes wide with terror.
He's in there again, Ellery shrieked.
He watches from the chair. He never stops watching. Simon calmed him, sedated him, but the words echoed in his mind. The next day, he checked B113 again. Empty.
But now, the chair in the corner faced the bed, and the pressure was stronger.
That night, he dreamed of the room. In the dream, he stood just inside the doorway, frozen.
A man sat in the chair, gaunt, pale, face wrapped in shadow.
He didn't move, didn't speak, but Simon could feel his gaze like a needle through the center of his chest.
He woke in a cold sweat. heart hammering, ears ringing.
From then on, it worsened. He began hearing soft footsteps in the empty hall when making his rounds.
Once, he found fresh muddy footprints leading from room B113 to the staff lounge.
The viewing slot, once sealed, now hung open. No one admitted to touching it. Then the patient started whispering. Even those catatonic from trauma seemed to recognize something in that room. "Doctor," one muttered as he adjusted her chart. "Do you hear the hum yet?" "Hum?" She blinked, unseeing.
That's how he calls.
"He hums so you'll come sit down." Simon stopped sleeping. The dreams came every night now. The man never moved, never rose, but each night he was closer.
In one dream, Simon found himself sitting in a chair, looking across the room at a version of himself, lying silently on the bed.
Watching, just watching, on his final night at SD.
Elora's Simon snapped. He walked the West Wing halls barefoot, eyes vacant. Security cameras caught him speaking to no one. Standing before the door to B113 for over 40 minutes. At precisely 3:06 a.m., he opened the door.
The camera outside the room recorded what happened next. Simon stepped inside and immediately froze. His body went rigid.
Face slapped. He turned, very slowly, toward the corner.
Toward the chair. Then, without a word, he closed the door behind him. The next morning, room B113 was empty. No one could find Dr. Simon Harlan.
His belongings were still in his office, his car untouched in the staff lot.
Only the quiet room remained, changed.
The chair was no longer in the corner.
It now sat beside the bed, facing the door. Staff began hearing the hum soon after. A pressure deep in the ears. A pull toward the door. They sealed B113 permanently, welded it shut. But every so often, at exactly 3:06 a.m., a hum rolls through the West Wing like a low drone.
And patients still say, "He's watching." Story 6. The Man Beneath the Eyes. It was supposed to be a 6-week solo research assignment. A glaciology survey at Outpost K17. Nestled in the forgotten reaches of the northern tundra, 17 miles from the next living soul.
Funded by a Scandinavian university, designed for isolation, stocked with months of rations. Dr. Lena Miles, a seasoned field scientist, had done work in Antarctica, Siberia, even the Himalayas. This was routine, or so she thought.
The outpost sat half buried in snow and ice, its observation window facing a long, flat plain of permafrost.
During her first week, the cold never let up, not even a little.
Temperatures stayed brutal, wind never stopped howling, and the ice beneath the station ground at night like it was dreaming.
It started on day 9.
Lena was logging temperature flux when she noticed something strange, a small, circular dip in the ice about 30 meters from the station. It hadn't been there before.
She was sure of it.
Curious, she suited up and trudged out. It was a shallow depression, only about 6 feet across, rigged with fine cracks like frost spiderwebs. Kneeling, she brushed away the snow crust. The ice below was oddly clear,
and beneath it, maybe 8 inches down, was a face.
Her breath caught in her throat. A man's face.
Pale, eyes shut, mouth parted slightly in what looked like a sigh.
His skin was smooth, untouched by time.
No frostbite, no rot, no decay, just
frozen.
It couldn't be real.
She tapped gently on the ice with her gloved knuckle. No response. Lena returned to the outpost, shaken, trying to rationalize. An old corpse, perfectly preserved.
Possibly a trapper, or maybe a geological anomaly, a trick of light.
But that night, just after the outpost lights flickered.
The generator stuttered, though fuel was full.
And from her bunk, she heard scraping.
Not inside, below.
The metal floor groaned faintly under her bed as if someone was dragging their fingers along it. Slow and steady. She didn't sleep.
The next morning, she went back to the dip in the eyes.
Her breath misted in front of her, hands trembling.
The snow had been cleared again.
She hadn't touched it.
And the face was closer, now just 4 inches beneath the surface.
Its eyes were open, dark, glassy, staring up.
She stumbled back, falling onto the eyes. He was looking right at her.
She reported the discovery via satellite link, but transmission lag was bad. and no one responded.
Later that night, she reviewed the images she'd taken that day, but in each one, the figure in the ice was in a slightly different position. Not dramatically, just small things, head tilted, mouth closed,
Eyes focused somewhere else.
She checked the outside camera feed. At 3:11 a.m., the camera showed movement, something tall, vague, and shrouded in ice mist, standing directly outside the window for nearly 15 minutes, just standing.
She hadn't heard a thing. The next morning, the depression in the ice was gone, filled in.
No face beneath, just smooth, undisturbed snow. She should have been relieved.
But that night, she woke to footsteps in the hallway.
Heavy,
Deliberate.
she waited, breath held, flashlight in hand. The steps stopped outside her bunk.
Then the whispering began.
It wasn't in English, nor any language she could name, just a cold, liquid murmur, like water being poured inside a cavern.
She rose, heart hammering, and flung open the door.
The hall was empty, except for one thing, a trail of melted water. Bare footprints leading from the outer door to the hatch beneath the outpost floor.
The hatch she'd never opened. She followed them, against every instinct.
The metal hatch creaked as she lifted it.
Below, only darkness.
A tight maintenance crawl space. The air down there smelled of salt and iron.
A faint voice whispered, "I remember your breath on the ice."
She slammed the hatch shut.
Her final log, dated day 15, was a frantic audio message, never sent. "He's not in the ice anymore. He's underneath now.
I hear him moving at night. Sometimes I see his breath in the vents.
I don't think I'm supposed to leave.
I think he's been waiting for someone to see him, to wake him up.
I shouldn't have touched the eyes."
Transmission ends. When a rescue crew arrived 2 weeks later, the station was intact. Everything in order. Except Lena was gone. Only her boots remained by the hatch, and on the frost glass window, a single breath mark lingered, slowly fading from the inside. Beneath the outpost, they found the crawl space filled with water, black still, cold,
And far, far below the eyes.
The cameras picked up a single, pale hand pressed gently to the frozen ceiling.
Story 7. The House That Sleeps.
The manor at Ashbrook Hollow was not abandoned in the usual sense. It still stood firm, its roof mostly intact, its windows unshuttered by time or trespassers.
It wasn't crumbling into the earth like the rest of the region's forgotten estates.
Instead, it seemed untouched, as if it simply fell asleep 100 years ago and had not yet woken.
Gideon Hart, a freelance surveyor with a fascination for derelict properties, arrived on a cold April morning with his gear and a grant from a preservation trust.
His task, to map, photograph, and record what remained of Ashbrook before its rumored demolition.
Locals had warned him off. They say the house breathes. One old woman said through tobacco-stained teeth.
Not in a metaphor. In truth, it inhales, waits, sleeps.
He thought it superstition.
Country dramatics. Until he stepped through the front door.
The interior was clean,
Dustless.
no cobwebs.
Furniture sat where it always had, draped in heavy velvet.
A piano, untouched, stood with its keys bare to the silence.
There were no animals,
No mice.
no decay, just stillness like time had paused, not passed.
As he walked through the entrance hall, his boots made no sound. None.
Not even the soft creak of wood, just a heavy quiet, ache and pressing, like the air was holding its breath. Gideon's camera flickered when he tried to take pictures.
Batteries drained faster than they should.
His phone showed no signal, even though he'd had reception a mile up the road. He made a note of it. In the parlor, he found a strange detail. A tea set laid out on a small table, 4 cups, still steaming. He leaned close. The tea was hot.
That was the first moment his bravado cracked. He turned quickly.
And that's when he noticed the portraits. All the paintings lining the hall had once shown Ashbrook's long-dead residents. Staid men, pale women, unsmiling children.
Now they were different. Every subject's eyes had been painted shut, and each canvas had fresh, wet brushstrokes around the lids.
He touched one. Paint.
Still tacky. His hand trembled.
I'm not alone here, he whispered.
And as if in answer, the house sighed. A soft groaning exhaled. from deep in the wood.
The chandelier swayed gently, though no wind blew. The floor felt warmer, like something beneath was stirring.
Still, he stayed. He told himself it was nonsense.
A trick of nerves. He returned to the foyer, only to find that the front door, the one he'd entered through, was gone. Not locked. Gone. Where it had been was now just solid wall, with wallpaper aged to match the rest of the house.
Panic began to bloom in his gut.
He ran room to room, seeking an exit. Each window he looked through showed different weather, some fogged over, some snowy, one even bathed in orange twilight.
None of them matched what he'd seen outside. Time here, he realized, was fractured.
The house was dreaming, and it had drawn him in. On the second day, though he could no longer tell how time moved, he heard movement upstairs. Heavy, slow footsteps.
But when he climbed the main staircase, every step echoed with two distinct sounds. One from his boot, and another a half-second later.
Like something was mimicking him,
Following, just slightly behind.
In the master bedroom, he found a tall four-poster bed, its canopy drawn. The curtains stirred as if something had just slipped inside. He pulled them back quickly, empty, except for the pillow.
On it, an impression of a human head.
Warm.
As he backed away, the house whispered. A word. He couldn't tell what it was, but it was a name.
His name, Gideon.
Spoken from the walls, soft and close.
The journal he left behind found weeks later by a demolition crew contained only a few pages.
The rest were blank. The last entry read,
"It's not haunted.
That's not the word.
It isn't angry or evil.
It's tired. It dreams with walls and breathes through doors. I've walked in circles and I always come back to the same hall. I think I'm in its memory now. I think the house is dreaming about me." They never found his body. But now, those who visit Ashbrook, usually thrill-seeking urban explorers, report strange things.
Photos vanish from memory cards. GPS loops in impossible spirals.
And sometimes, if you listen hard near the main stairwell, you can hear footsteps. 2 sets, and in the grand hall hangs a new portrait. A man in hiking boots, holding a camera.
His eyes are painted shut.
Story 8. The Lamplighter's Field. There was a stretch of land just outside the village of Windermere where no one built. No one walked, and no one spoke of not for generations. Locals called it Lamplighter's Field, though no one could explain why.
It was a wide, windswept plain of yellowing grass, flat as glass, and always oddly silent. No birds flew overhead, no insects.
Even the trees on its border leaned away, their branches like reaching arms turned back in fear.
No road cut through it. No house stood on its edge.
But every few nights, if the air was still and the moon thin, a light would appear.
A single oil lantern, swinging back and forth slowly through the dark. Some said it was a ghost. Some said it was worse.
Ben Halter didn't believe in either.
He was an archaeology graduate working on a dissertation about lost English folk traditions.
When he stumbled upon references to the field in several 17th century journals, he knew he had to investigate. Folklore this specific always hinted at something deeper: ritual sites, burial grounds, superstition fossilized into geography.
He rented a cottage in Windermere and asked around.
People grew tight-lipped when he brought it up.
Even the old man at the pub who'd spent 30 years talking everyone's ear off about crop circles refused to speak on Lamplighter's Field.
"You see that light?" he muttered once, staring into his pint. "You turn around.
Don't you walk toward it. Don't look twice." Ben, naturally, did the opposite. He set out at dusk with his field recorder, camera and notebook, determined to demystify the legend. He reached the edge of the field just as night fell. Windless.
The air heavy. His boots crunched the dry grass, but there was no echo, only stillness.
He waited.
2 hours in, he saw it. A lantern, golden and warm, swinging gently far across the field. No figure.
Just the light, moving smoothly as if carried. He zoomed in with his camera. Nothing. No person. Just empty air and the swinging glow. Fascinated, he stepped onto the field. The moment his foot crossed the grass line, the light paused, hung still in the air. Then it began to swing faster.
Ben hesitated.
Every instinct told him to stop.
But he couldn't.
He stepped forward again. The light backed away. It didn't vanish, it withdrew. like it was leading him somewhere.
Slowly, smoothly,
He followed. For over an hour, it drew him deep into the center of the field. The grass around him began to darken, not in color but in presence, as if the land here wasn't quite real.
his legs felt heavier.
His thoughts slower. The light eventually stopped near a single standing stone, no taller than a man's chest, covered in ancient glyphs.
Ben knelt to examine it.
The light hovered beside him, swaying softly, almost expectantly.
He reached out and touched the stone,
And the lantern went out. Instantly,
pitch black fell,
and in that silence he heard it.
footsteps,
Not coming toward him, all around him.
surrounding him.
Hundreds, soft, slow, in the grass. He scrambled for his flashlight.
When he turned it on, he nearly dropped it.
The field was filled with figures, shadow-thin, long-limbed, faceless. Dozens, maybe more. They stood in total silence, surrounding the stone, unmoving, watching.
All held lanterns.
Unlit, Ben backed away slowly, heart hammering in his throat.
Then one of them lifted its lantern, as if offering it to him, and the moment his light flickered across its face, he saw it wasn't faceless at all. It wore his face.
Eyes blank, mouth parted, cold as stone. He ran. The field didn't fight him.
Didn't shift or twist.
It just watched.
He didn't stop until he reached the edge. When he turned back, the field was empty again.
The wind had returned.
But in his back, his camera was gone.
Only his field recorder remained. He played it back later.
It began normally wind, grass, notes, but toward the end, something strange.
A whisper.
Dozens of voices speaking in unison.
The lamplight shows your shape.
Now we remember you. That was a month ago.
Ben tried to forget it. But each night, just before sleep, he hears a soft clink.
Like glass tapping metal. And in the corners of his flat, just for a moment.
A warm golden glow swaying in the dark.
Story 9. The 8th room. Eliza Mary moved into the Bellwether boarding house in late October, drawn by its ivy-choked brickwork and cheap rent.
The building, once a grand Victorian manor, had been subdivided into small apartments, each with creaking floors, high ceilings, and the stale scent of old wood and mothballs.
Her room was at the top of the main staircase, labelled Room 7. There were 7 tenants in total, 1 in each room.
She was introduced to them one by one: a quiet, jittery man in room 1, a retired pianist in room 5, and others whose names she forgot quickly, as none seemed eager for conversation.
They kept their doors closed, their footsteps muffled, but what struck Eliza as odd was the layout. She walked the hall from end to end, counted the doors herself.
There were 8. The 8th door, at the far end of the corridor, bore no number. Its knob was tarnished brass, and its frame had a strange way of looking taller than the others, as if it didn't quite fit the geometry of the house. She asked the landlady about it, an elderly woman with a hoarse voice and cataract-milky eyes. "That room isn't rented," she said curtly. "Never has been."
But what's inside?
"Nothing for you to worry about." Eliza let it go. At first,
But every night, around to 11 a.m., she began hearing the sound of a door creaking open.
always the same time, always slow, reluctant, as if the house itself didn't want it to happen. And then came the footsteps, heavy, dragging, muffled by the carpet, but unmistakable.
Not toward her door, but past it.
Always toward the stairwell. Once, she opened her door quickly enough to see the hall emptied.
But the 8th door
Was ajar, only by an inch. The next morning, it was closed again. She knocked once, just to prove to herself it was empty. No answer.
But that night, to 11 a.m. came again.
And this time, when the door opened, it made a different sound. Not just wood against wood.
It groaned like something waking up.
On the 6th night, the footsteps paused in front of her door. She held her breath, pressed to the wall. Something scratched at the wood. A single word whispered through the gap beneath the door. 8. Then silence. She moved out of the room and slept on the floor of the building's small communal library.
She told herself she'd find a new place the next day. But in the morning, her room was gone.
Where room 7 had been was now a blank wall.
No door, no knock, as if she'd never lived there.
When she asked the other tenants, They just stared at her.
"There is no room 7, said the pianist. "There are only 6 rooms."
She tried to leave the building.
Every exit brought her back to the hall. Every staircase spiraled upward, ending at the 8th door.
The landlady was gone. The tenants no longer answered their doors.
It was just her.
And the 8th room.
By the 9th night, Eliza gave up trying to fight the rhythm of the house.
She stood outside the door and waited.
At 2:11 a.m., it opened for her.
Inside was not a room. Not truly. It was a long, grey corridor with no ceiling. The walls sloped upward into darkness. The floor was smooth black glass. And down the corridor, barely visible in the gloom, stood a mirror. She walked toward it slowly.
When she reached it, she saw herself pale, trembling.
But her reflection didn't mimic her. It watched her. Then it opened its mouth and whispered, "You've always lived in room 8."
She turned to run, but the corridor was gone. Now, only the room.
Dusty, silent, bare.
And on the wall, etched into the plaster, was a number.
8 a week later, the boarding house had 7 tenants again, and room 7 had a new occupant.
A nervous young man with no knowledge of Eliza.
He asked the landlady about the 8th door. She smiled, eyes glassy and distant.
"There are only 7 rooms," she said. "But every night, at 2:11 a.m., the man hears a door open down the hall. And once, just before sleep, he heard something scratch at the wood and whisper, 9. Story 10. Beneath the Willow's Veil. The town of Gilead was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the past hung thick like morning fog. At the edge of town, by the old cemetery, stood a lone willow tree, ancient and gnarled, its long branches draping like a curtain over a small stone bench. The townsfolk called it the Veil Willow, whispering that it guarded secrets better left buried.
Claire Donner, who had returned home after 10 years away.
The city life had been noisy and cold, but something about Gilead, about that willow, pulled at her memory, specifically the summer before her disappearance at age 16, when her closest friend, Sam, vanished beneath those branches.
She remembered the stories. Sam had been found wandering near the willow one night, muttering in a voice that wasn't his own. Days later, his family moved away. Claire never understood what had happened until now.
She came back to face it.
Her first visit to the willow was on a damp afternoon. Rain hung heavy, and the air smelled of wet earth and old leaves. The willow's branches shimmered, barely moving, as if holding their breath.
Claire sat on the stone bench beneath the curtain of green, feeling the chill seep through her jacket.
She whispered, "Sam?" The silence answered.
That night, strange dreams visited her. She was back as a child, running through the cemetery, shadows flickering between the gravestones.
A voice called her name, gentle but urgent. She followed it to the willow, but when she reached out to touch its bark, the ground beneath her gave way.
She fell into darkness.
When she woke, she was gasping for breath, lying on the damp grass beneath the tree. Over the next few days, Claire became obsessed. She researched the willow, finding old records of strange disappearances around the cemetery young people lost. Some found months later, eyes hollow, voices changed.
The townspeople avoided talking about it.
The willow, it seemed, had always been a boundary. On the 7th night, Claire returned to the tree with a lantern.
The rain had stopped, but a thick mist curled around the base. As she reached to touch the trunk, a faint glow pulsed beneath the bark, like a heartbeat.
Suddenly, the branches shifted, parting to reveal a narrow, descending stair carved into the earth.
Her heart pounded. She hesitated.
Then, driven by a force she couldn't explain, she stepped down. The stairway was damp, lined with roots and soil, and descended into a cavern deep beneath the cemetery. The air smelled of moss and something metallic. At the bottom, she found a room carved from stone. Walls were etched with symbols ancient, indecipherable, but the center held a small altar draped in black cloth. On it lay a mirror, its surface rippling like water.
Claire approached. As she peered into the glass, her reflection blurred and twisted, revealing faces not her own Sam's, pale and hollow.
Others, eyes wide with silent screams. The mirror whispered, "We are the veil. We wait beneath the willow's veil."
Claire's breath caught.
The water in the mirror rippled, and suddenly, a hand reached out,
Frozen, she stared as the hand grasped hers, pulling. Her scream echoed in the chamber as the world turned cold and dark.
When the townsfolk found the willow the next day, it was silent, branches still, but the stone bench bore a single mark, an impression of two hands reaching out. Claire was never seen again.
Story 11. The Lighthouse Keeper's Shadow.
For decades, the old lighthouse at Crow's Point stood sentinel against the stormy seas, a lone tower where waves smashed relentlessly and winds howled like the cries of lost souls.
Its light hadn't shone for years, decommissioned and left to rot. But the townsfolk still whispered of the last keeper, Elias Brandt, who vanished without a trace one stormy night.
Nathan Crane was an outsider, a writer fascinated by the uncanny, seeking inspiration for his next book. The lighthouse, with its peeling white paint and rusted iron staircase, seemed the perfect place to immerse himself in solitude.
The town council reluctantly granted him access, warning only, don't stay past midnight.
Nathan arrived in late autumn, the air thick with salt and chill. The path to the lighthouse was muddy and overgrown. Inside, the place smelled of mildew and old metal, with broken windows that let in a relentless sea wind. The spiral staircase groaned under his boots as he climbed to the lantern room at the top.
That first evening, Nathan set up his equipment, cameras, notebooks, and a small recorder.
The sun slipped behind the cliffs, bleeding orange into the sky, and the sea turned black and restless.
As night deepened, the storm rolled in.
Thunder rumbled overhead, and rain hammered the windows like fists.
Nathan sat near the lighthouse's rusted controls, jotting down notes about the old keeper's life, when he heard it. Footsteps, slow, measured, coming up the stairs.
He called out. No answer. The footsteps stopped.
The silence that followed was thicker than the storm. Then, a soft scrape like nails dragging down the metal railing.
Nathan's pulse quickened.
He aimed his flashlight down the staircase, but saw nothing. He chalked it up to the wind. Later, in the dead hours, his recorder picked up a voice low and rasping.
You shouldn't be here. Nathan spun the recorder around. Silence. He played it back.
The voice repeated, clearer.
The shadow stays when the light goes out.
Determined, Nathan ventured outside despite the tempest.
Near the lighthouse base, a figure stood just beyond the reach of the floodlights. A man-shaped shadow, tall and thin, draped in what looked like an old oilskin coat. Elias, Nathan called, stepping closer. The figure turned slowly. The face was obscured by shadow, but the eyes gleamed with something cold and hungry.
Suddenly, the figure vanished as if swallowed by the fog.
Back inside, Nathan found the lighthouse light long dark, still connected to the old mechanisms. On a hunch, he flipped the switch. The lens spun, casting a beam slicing through rain and night. For a moment, the storm seemed to still.
Then the walls trembled. From the lantern room's corner, the shadow moved. It wasn't cast by the light. It was its own thing, darkness concentrated, crawling along the walls like spilled ink. The shadow whispered, the keeper's debt is not paid.
Nathan scrambled down the stairs, but the shadow followed hunting. He burst through the front door into the rain.
The townsfolk say the lighthouse light flickered briefly that night, then went off forever.
Nathan was never seen again.
But when the storm rolls in at Crow's Point, some say the light shines faintly, and the shadow moves just beyond the beam waiting for the keeper's return. Story 12. Whispers in the Hollow.
The Hollow was a place people spoke of only in hushed tones, a narrow valley nestled between jagged hills where the trees grew twisted and the air seemed heavier, thicker, as if soaked with secrets.
No one lived there anymore, at least, not in a way the world outside understood. Nora had inherited her grandmother's farmhouse on the edge of the hollow. A practical woman, she saw the move as a chance to escape city life and begin anew.
But the locals warned her. Don't stay after dark, they said. The hollow doesn't like visitors. On her first night, Nora noticed the silence.
Not the quiet you expect in rural places, the kind that hums with life and distant calls, but a dead silence that swallowed every sound.
No crickets, no owls, no rustling of leaves. Just nothing.
She wrapped herself in blankets, the old house creaking around her.
Through the window, the twisted branches of the trees pressed close.
like skeletal fingers.
At midnight, the whispers began, soft, indistinct, words she couldn't catch, but voices layered like echoes urgent, pleading, cold.
Mara thought it was the wind,
But then the whispers sharpened. A voice childlike, desperate, called her name. Mara. She froze, heart thudding.
"Who's there?"
She whispered.
Silence.
The next nights grew worse. Figures flickered at the edges of her vision, shapes that vanished when she turned. Doors creaked open and slammed shut on their own.
One evening, drawn by the whispers, Mara found herself outside, standing before an ancient well hidden beneath the roots of a great tree. She peered inside. Blackness stared back. Then a faint glow rose from the depths, tiny points of light like fireflies, swirling upward with soft, haunting music.
A voice rose from the well, echoing, "Come down, come down."
Mara staggered back, fear freezing her limbs. She locked herself inside, but the whispers followed, pressing against the walls like a tide. Days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and creeping dread.
On the seventh night, Mara finally understood. The hollow was a trap.
The voices were those who'd been taken lost souls lured into the darkness, and now they wanted her.
The last entry in her journal was found months later by a search party. It read, "They are everywhere now. In the walls, the well, the wind. I cannot leave. I hear their voices, calling me deeper. The hollow will not let me go."
Mara was gone,
The house stands empty,
but at night, if you listen, the hollow whispers her name.
and sometimes the well glows faintly, waiting.
Story 13. The Forgotten Railway.
The old railway line had been abandoned for decades, swallowed by overgrowth and time.
Locals said the trains had stopped running after a tragic accident during the war, a derailment that killed dozens and left the tracks cursed. Few dared to venture near the rusted rails, especially after dusk. Lena was a photographer fascinated by forgotten places. When she heard about the abandoned railway, she packed her gear and drove to the edge of the nearby forest, where the tracks disappeared into darkness.
The sun was setting as she stepped onto the first creaking wooden sleeper, the air thick with damp and decay. Every step echoed unnervingly, the silence broken only by distant calls and the rustle of leaves.
As she moved deeper along the line, the trees thickened, their shadows lengthening into unnatural shapes.
The faint sound of metal scraping whispered on the wind.
Lena's camera clicked, capturing the dying light.
Suddenly,
a cold gust swept the air, carrying a faint whistle, soft but clear, like a train approaching from nowhere.
she froze. The tracks ahead gleamed under an unseen light, and the air vibrated with a low hum. She stepped forward cautiously, eyes searching for the source.
Then, through the trees, a ghostly outline appeared. A train, translucent and shimmering, slowly gliding along the rails. Its carriages rattled silently, windows empty and dark.
Lena's breath caught. The train slowed to a stop.
The doors creaked open. From the shadows stepped figures, pale, expressionless, faces blurred.
They moved like marionettes, their limbs stiff, eyes vacant. The closest figure turned slowly, locking eyes with Lena.
She felt a chill crawl up her spine.
The figure spoke in a hollow voice.
"You must board.
The journey never ends." Lena stumbled back, heart pounding.
Behind her, the forest seemed to close in. She turned and ran, branches clawing at her clothes, the ghost train's whistle rising behind her. When she reached her car, breathless and shaking, she dared one last glance.
The tracks were empty, the forest silent. But in her camera, the last photo showed the train, closer than before, and a hand reaching out from the darkness.
Lena never spoke of what she saw.
But sometimes, when night falls, she hears the whistle soft and distant calling her back.
Story 14. Echoes of the Moor.
The moor stretched out like an endless sea of heather and mist, rolling hills disappearing into the grey sky. Few dared to cross it alone, especially as twilight descended and the wind began to wail through the grasses.
Mark Harper was a cartographer, commissioned to map the last uncharted sections of the moor. He welcomed the solitude and the challenge, setting out early one autumn morning with a tent, compass, and journal. The first days were uneventful, save for the relentless wind and the biting chill at night. But soon, things began to feel wrong. At dawn, Mark would find strange markings on the ground, circles etched into the earth, perfect and unnaturally clean, as if carved by meticulous hands. No footprints or signs of human presence, only the circles. At night, the moor's wind seemed to carry whispers, faint and unintelligible, drifting through the tall grass. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark noticed a figure standing far off in the mist, an old woman, wrapped in a threadbare shawl, her back turned to him. He called out, but she didn't move.
Curious and cautious, Mark approached.
As he drew near, the woman vanished.
Only a soft chuckle remained, echoing across the moor.
The next day, Mark's compass spun wildly, refusing to point north.
His maps became confusing, landmarks shifting with the terrain as if the moor itself was alive and rearranging. He grew disoriented, lost among the swirling mists.
At night, the whispers grew louder, forming words.
Turn back, leave the moor, or stay forever.
Mark ignored the warnings. On the fourth night, he found himself at the center of a great stone circle, stones worn and moss-covered, their faces blank. Suddenly, the air chilled, and the stones began to hum. Shadows twisted between them, taking shape figures from ancient times, their eyes burning with a cold fire. They stepped closer, voices rising in a chant that froze Mark's blood.
His last journal entry, found months later, ended mid-sentence. The moor is not land, it is a living memory, and I am its prisoner. No one saw Mark again.
But sometimes, when the wind howls over the moor, travelers swear they hear chanting carried in the night and see figures standing silently among the stones, waiting.
Story 15. The Silent House on Elm Street.
The house at 142 Elm Street had stood empty for nearly 20 years. Its windows boarded, the paint peeling like dead skin. Locals called it the Silent House because no sound ever seemed to escape its walls, no creak, no whisper, no footsteps. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting.
Julian, a young architect with a fascination for old buildings, was drawn to the house's stillness. He acquired the property on a whim, intent on restoring it to its former glory.
The town warned him. No one's lived there for decades. Strange things happen. Ignoring the warnings, Julian moved in late November, the chill of winter creeping through the cracks.
The first days were quiet, almost too quiet. No birds sang nearby. No wind stirred the dead leaves, just an oppressive stillness. On the third night, Julian heard a faint tapping at the back window.
He peered outside but saw nothing but shadows flickering beneath the skeletal branches of the elm tree.
The tapping became a nightly ritual, always at 13 a.m., steady and deliberate.
One night, following the sound, Julian discovered a loose board on the floor of the basement.
Beneath it lay a trapdoor, leading to a narrow, dark tunnel. Compelled by a mixture of fear and curiosity, he descended. The tunnel was lined with crumbling bricks and smelled of damp earth and decay. At its end was a small room, bare except for a rusted metal chair facing the wall. On the chair was a diary, its pages yellowed and brittle. Julian opened it and began to read.
The diary belonged to a woman named Agnes, who lived in the house during the early 1900s. Her entries told of a presence in the house, a shadow that watched, waited, and whispered promises of escape from loneliness. Agnes wrote that she was never truly alone, that something lived beneath the floorboards, feeding on silence and sorrow. The final entry was a scrawl of desperate words.
It calls me in the dark. I can hear its breath. I cannot run. As Julian read, the air grew cold, and the tapping resumed, this time from within the walls themselves.
He tried to leave the basement, but found the tunnel sealed behind him. In the oppressive silence, the whisper began. Stay with us.
In the silent house, days later, neighbors noticed the house's windows were no longer boarded, but no one saw Julian leave. Inside, the silence had deepened, waiting for the next visitor to hear the tapping at 13 a.m.
Story 16. The Lantern in Blackwood Forest.
Blackwood Forest was ancient, a tangled maze of towering trees and shadowed paths that few dared to enter after dusk. Stories whispered among the nearby villagers spoke of a lantern that appeared in the depths of the woods, an eerie, flickering light that led travelers astray.
Elliot was a natural skeptic, a photographer eager to capture something unique for his portfolio.
He ventured into Blackwood on a damp autumn evening, the sky heavy with clouds and the first drops of rain beginning to fall. The forest welcomed him with a chilling silence, broken only by the crunch of dead leaves beneath his boots.
As he wandered deeper, the canopy thickened, swallowing what little light remained.
Suddenly, a soft glow appeared ahead, bobbing gently like a candle in the wind. Curiosity overcame caution. Elliot followed the lantern's light as it danced between the trees, deeper and deeper into the forest's heart. The air grew colder.
His breath formed pale clouds.
The path twisted unnaturally, as if the forest itself shifted with each step.
At times, Elliot thought he saw figures just beyond the light shapes that vanished when he blinked.
The lantern's glow pulsed, steady and hypnotic, drawing him forward. Hours passed, or maybe minutes.
Time lost meaning.
Eventually, the light stopped at a small clearing surrounded by dead, gnarled trees. In the center lay an old, broken well, moss-covered and forgotten.
The lantern hovered above the well's mouth, illuminating something inside, a faint, pulsing glow far below.
Elliot felt a chill press against his spine.
He lowered his camera, focusing on the well.
From the depths came a whisper, soft and coaxing. "Come down.
Come join us."
The lantern flickered erratically, as if warning or inviting.
Elliot's rational mind screamed to leave, but his feet moved forward, toward the edge of the well. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the darkness below, grasping the stone rim.
Elliot stumbled back, heart racing. The lantern's light exploded, bathing the clearing in blinding white.
When the light faded, Elliot was alone, no lantern, no well, just the forest and its oppressive silence. Days later, villagers noticed a new lantern's glow bobbing in Blackwood Forest after nightfall.
But Elliot was never seen again.
Story 17. The window in Room 7. Room 7 in the Ashford Hotel was never rented out.
Not officially, anyway. The faded brass number on the door was chipped and tarnished, the paint peeling like dead skin.
Staff whispered about strange noises, soft crying, footsteps pacing the hallway late at night. No guest ever dared ask for it.
Daniel, a traveling journalist chasing a story on abandoned hotels, checked in on a rainy evening, curious about the rumors.
The lobby was dim and smelled of dust and old wood. The receptionist warned him with a tired smile. Room 7's of limits.
Best not to ask why.
But curiosity was a stronger force.
Later that night, Daniel found himself drawn down the long corridor to the forbidden door. The hallway lights flickered, casting jittery shadows that seemed to flicker and pulse with unseen movement. He hesitated, then turned the knob. The room was empty, except for a single window facing the street below, but something was wrong.
Through the glass, the street looked
wrong, distorted. The world beyond seemed muted, washed out like a faded photograph. Daniel approached the window, wiping away grime. Suddenly, a face appeared on the other side, a pale woman with hollow eyes, pressing her hands against the glass. He stumbled back, heart pounding. The woman's lips moved silently, mouthing words he couldn't hear. The lights flickered violently. The door slammed shut behind him. Trapped,
Daniel turned back to the window.
The woman was gone, but the street outside had changed. Now, it showed a scene from decades ago. People in old-fashioned clothes, horse-drawn carriages, gas lamps flickering in the night. The room grew cold. A whisper seeped from the walls. "You can never leave, not once you've seen through the window." Daniel pounded the door. It held firm. The window darkened, then brightened, showing another scene. A man standing in the room, staring at Daniel with empty eyes. Daniel's breath caught. The figure raised a hand, beckoning.
The last thing he saw before the lights went out was his own reflection in a glass distorted, twisted, and the pale woman's face beside his own.
Days later, staff found Room 7's door locked tight.
Daniel was gone.
But sometimes, guests swear they see a pale face watching them through the hotel window, waiting.
Story 18. The Clockmaker's Curse.
The small village of Hallows End had long been known for its solitary clock tower, a relic from centuries past that stood at the heart of the town square.
For generations, the clock chimed solemnly every hour, marking the passage of time like a heartbeat for the village.
But after the clockmaker, Elias Merton, died mysteriously, the chimes stopped altogether, and an uneasy silence fell.
Jacob, a young horologist fascinated by the clock's intricate mechanisms, was called to repair the ancient tower.
He arrived just as dusk spilled over the village, the fading light casting long shadows through the narrow streets.
The villagers watched silently, their eyes clouded with worry. The tower was taller than Jacob expected, its iron staircase spiraling into darkness. As he climbed, the air grew thick with dust and something else, an old, metallic scent like blood mixed with oil. Jacob reached the clock face, its hands frozen at 11:59. Below, the village lay in eerie stillness. He began his work, inspecting years and springs long neglected. At midnight, the clock suddenly shuddered and the chimes began a slow, dragging toll that echoed through the night. But it was not the clear, rhythmic sound Jacob expected. This toll was warped, twisted, like metal scraping against bone.
A cold wind swept through the tower, extinguishing his lantern.
In the darkness, he heard whispers soft, unintelligible at first, then sharper. Time is dead.
Time is blood.
Time never forgets. Jacob lit the lantern again, but the tower had changed. The shadows moved unnaturally, curling into shapes, faces twisted in agony, hands reaching out as if trapped inside the gears.
He tried to descend, but the staircase seemed endless, the steps stretching further into darkness.
The clock's hands moved backward, the chimes accelerating into a frantic, discordant rhythm. Jacob realized the clock was no ordinary timekeeper, it was a prison.
Elias Merton had trapped something inside the mechanism, something that fed on time and souls.
As the chimes reached a crescendo, Jacob felt a cold grip on his wrist. The last thing he saw was the clock face, its hands spinning wildly, and the faces in the shadows reaching out for him.
When villagers entered the tower the next day, the clock was silent again.
Jacob was gone, but sometimes at midnight, the distorted chimes return, echoing through the village a warning or a call.
Story 19. The portrait in the attic.
The old manor at Ravenswood had stood empty for years, its grandeur faded, its windows clouded with grime. Local legend told of a painter named Victor Hale, who once lived there and vanished mysteriously, leaving behind a collection of portraits rumored to trap the souls of their subjects.
Clara, an art restorer, was hired to catalog the manor's contents before it was sold.
The moment she stepped inside, the air felt heavy, thick with dust, silence, and something unspoken. Her footsteps echoed of the marble floors as she ascended the grand staircase toward the attic. The attic was cramped, lit only by a small, grimy window. Against the wall stood dozens of portraits, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. One painting caught Clara's eye, a portrait of a young woman, her face pale, eyes wide with silent terror. As Clara examined the painting, a chill ran through the room. The woman's eyes seemed to shimmer, and the faintest whisper brushed her ear. She spun around empty room. Over the next days, strange things happened. Clara felt watched, heard soft breathing behind her.
Objects moved when she wasn't looking,
and the portrait seemed to change, subtle shifts in expression, a tightening of a smile, flicker of shadow in the eyes. One night, drawn by an irresistible compulsion, Clara returned to the attic. The portraits glowed faintly, and the woman from the painting stepped forward, no longer an image, but a living shadow. "Help me." The voice was barely audible, trembling with despair.
Clara reached out.
The shadow recoiled, then smiled a grim, hollow grin. The attic door slammed shut. In the suffocating darkness, Clara's scream was swallowed by the walls. The next morning, workers found the attic empty except for the portraits, each with a new face, pale and terrified. Clara was never seen again.
But visitors claim that at Ravenswood Manor, on quiet nights, the portraits whisper, and the eyes of the painted woman plead silently for release. Story 20. Beneath the floorboards. The old Victorian house on Maple Street had stood untouched for decades. Its dark was warped by time, and its history whispered about only in shadows. When Nora inherited it from a distant relative she barely knew, she saw an opportunity, a fresh start away from the city's chaos. The first weeks were peaceful but eerie. The house groaned with the settling of its bones. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, and the air was thick with dust and something faintly metallic. But the strangest thing was the faint tapping noises that seemed to come from beneath the floor at odd intervals, soft, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. One rainy evening, as the wind howled outside and rain pattered relentlessly against the windows, Nora sat in the living room, notebook in hand, trying to write.
The tapping started again, persistent and deliberate.
Curiosity overcame caution. She knelt and pressed her ear to the floorboards.
The tapping shifted soft scratches, then a dragging sound, as if something was moving beneath.
Nora found an old crowbar and began prying up the loose floorboards. Beneath lay a narrow cavity, a shallow crawl space filled with old papers, fragments of cloth, and a small wooden box, sealed tight with rusted nails. Her hands trembled as she opened it.
Inside were yellowed letters, written in a shaky hand, describing a hidden room beneath the house, a room where the previous owner's family had locked away a terrible secret. The letters hinted at madness, voices from below, and a presence that never rested. That night, the tapping grew louder, accompanied by faint whispers just beyond comprehension. Nora dreamed of dark tunnels, walls closing in, and hands reaching up through the floor. In the morning, she found new scratches on the wall's deep gouges, as if claws had tried to escape.
Determined, she removed more floorboards, revealing a trapdoor covered in dust and cobwebs.
There from beneath was cold and stale. With a deep breath, Nora descended.
Below was a small, windowless room lined with crude symbols scratched into the walls. In the center sat a rocking chair, slowly moving back and forth despite no breeze.
Shadows danced in the dim light.
A voice, barely audible, whispered,
"You should not have come down." Nora tried to rise, but felt invisible hands grip her limbs.
Her screams echoed upward, but found no response.
Weeks later, neighbors reported strange sounds coming from the house, tapping, whispers, and the faint creak of a rocking chair moving alone in the darkness. Nora was never seen again. But sometimes, when the rain falls hard and the wind carries a mournful tune, the floorboards in that old house tap softly like a heartbeat waiting beneath the surface. Thanks for listening. If you made it to the end, let me know which story chilled you the most.